I pushed my chair back, so hard it scraped against the floor, and in that moment, I decided I was done being the doormat in my own home. My mother-in-law, Patricia, had just looked me dead in the eye across the Thanksgiving dinner table and said with a smirk that could cut glass, "You're not half the woman I am, dear." 23 years of marriage, countless holidays ruined, and endless passive-aggressive comments had all led to this single moment where something inside me finally snapped. My name is Caroline Mitchell, and I'm 45 years old, living in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. I've spent more than 2 decades trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, and somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be myself. My husband, David, sat there like he always did, fork frozen halfway to his mouth, eyes darting between his mother and me like he was watching a tennis match he desperately wanted to end but had no idea how to stop. Our 2 kids, Emma, who's 21 and studying at Georgia State, and Michael, who's 18 and just started at Georgia Tech, both stared down at their plates like the mashed potatoes held the secrets of the universe. The dining room in our Buckhead home was decorated exactly how Patricia had insisted it should be. She'd arrived 3 days before Thanksgiving, suitcases in hand, criticism locked and loaded. The turkey was too dry, she'd said, even before I'd taken it out of the oven. The cranberry sauce was store-bought, heaven forbid, because I'd been working 60-hour weeks at the marketing firm downtown and simply didn't have time to make it from scratch. The table settings were wrong. The napkins didn't match properly. My hair looked tired. I'd gained weight. The house wasn't as clean as it should be. On and on it went, a constant drip of disapproval that had started the moment David and I got engaged back in 2002. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you could click that subscribe button right now. We're working hard to reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Just hit that red button, and you'll be part of this growing community. Patricia Montgomery Hayes, my mother-in-law, was 68 years old and looked like she'd stepped out of a country club catalog from 1985. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, pearl earrings that probably cost more than my first car, and a permanent expression of smug superiority that made you feel about 2 inches tall. She'd been a debutante in Savannah back in her day, married David's father Richard, who made his fortune in real estate development, and she never let anyone forget that she was old Southern money, with all the entitlement that came with it. Richard had passed away 5 years ago from a heart attack, and since then, Patricia had become even more involved in David's life, which meant even more involved in mine. The comment about me not being half the woman she was came right after I'd politely suggested that maybe we could do Christmas at our house this year instead of driving 4 hours to her estate in Savannah like we did every single year. I'd simply said that the kids were getting older, that Emma might want to spend time with her boyfriend's family too, and that it would be nice to start some of our own traditions. Patricia's face had hardened like concrete, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then she delivered her verdict with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. When I pushed that chair back, the scraping sound cut through the awkward silence like a gunshot. I stood up slowly, my hands trembling slightly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The November evening light was fading through the windows, casting long shadows across the formal dining room that Patricia had criticized because the chandelier was apparently 2 inches off-center. I looked at David, really looked at him, and saw what I'd been seeing for years but refusing to acknowledge. He was a 47-year-old man who'd never truly cut the apron strings, who'd chosen peace over partnership, who'd let his mother walk all over his wife because it was easier than standing up to her. "Excuse me," I said quietly, my voice surprisingly steady. I walked out of the dining room, through the kitchen with its granite countertops that were never quite clean enough for Patricia, past the family room with its leather furniture that was too modern for her taste, and up the stairs to the master bedroom. I could hear the stunned silence below, then the scraping of another chair, probably David's, and the murmur of voices. I didn't care. I was done caring. I sat on the edge of our bed. The one Patricia had commented was too firm when she'd stayed with us last Christmas, and I started laughing. Not a happy laugh, but the kind of slightly hysterical laugh that comes when you realize you've been living a lie for so long that you've forgotten what truth even feels like. 23 years of biting my tongue. 23 years of being told I wasn't good enough, Didn't cook well enough, didn't clean well enough, didn't raise the kids right, didn't support David's career properly, didn't dress appropriately, didn't have the right friends, didn't come from the right family. 23 years of watching my husband nod along or stay silent or change the subject instead of defending me. The bedroom door opened and David walked in, his face pale, his tie loosened. He'd put on weight over the years, his sandy brown hair was thinning, and there were permanent worry lines etched into his forehead. He looked tired, I realized. We both looked tired. Tired of pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. "Caroline," he started, and I could hear the pleading in his voice. "Mom didn't mean it like that. She's just set in her ways. You know how she is." I stood up and looked at him, really looked at my husband, the man I'd fallen in love with at a Georgia Bulldogs football game back in 1999. He'd been charming and funny and ambitious, talking about his plans to join his father's real estate development company, about the life we'd build together. He'd promised me partnership, equality, love. What he'd delivered was a supporting role in the Patricia Hayes Show, where I was the actress who never quite hit her marks. "I know exactly how she is, David," I said, and my voice was calm now, eerily calm. "What I'm trying to figure out is how you are. Because the man I married would never have let his mother speak to his wife that way. The man I married would have stood up for me years ago. But that man doesn't exist anymore, does he? Or maybe he never existed at all." David's face crumpled, and he sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "That's not fair, Caroline. I'm stuck in the middle here. She's my mother. What am I supposed to do?" If you're listening to this and thinking about how relationships require boundaries and respect, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription helps us grow this channel. Your support means we can keep bringing you these real stories about real people. "You're supposed to be my husband first," I said, and I felt tears starting to sting my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "You're supposed to choose us, choose our family, not let her dictate every holiday, every decision, every aspect of our lives." I can't remember the last time we did something without checking if it was okay, with Patricia first. The truth of those words hung in the air between us. Downstairs, I could hear Patricia's voice, sharp and insistent, probably telling the kids what an ungrateful daughter-in-law I was. I wondered if they were defending me, or if they'd learned to stay silent too, following their father's example. That Thanksgiving night was the beginning of the end of my marriage as I knew it, though I didn't realize it yet. I slept in the guest room. The one Patricia always complained had too firm a mattress, and I lay awake thinking about my life. I'd given up a promising career in advertising when Emma was born because Patricia had strong opinions about working mothers. I'd moved to this house in Buckhead because it was closer to David's office, and his mother approved of the neighborhood. I'd joined the country club Patricia belonged to, attended the charity events she organized, befriended the women she deemed acceptable. I'd molded myself into a shape that might finally earn her approval, and it had never been enough. It would never be enough. The next morning, Black Friday, I got up early before anyone else was awake. The house was quiet, peaceful without Patricia's commentary. I made myself coffee, sat at the kitchen island, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I Googled my own name plus my maiden name, Caroline Pierce. What came up surprised me. There were old articles about campaigns I'd worked on in my 20s, a few industry awards I'd won, references to creative work I'd done that I'd completely forgotten about. I'd been good at my job. I'd been passionate about it. And I'd given it all up because keeping Patricia happy had seemed more important than keeping myself whole. I heard footsteps on the stairs and braced myself, but it was Emma, not Patricia. My daughter padded into the kitchen in her pajamas, her dark hair messy from sleep, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from me at the island. "Mom," she said quietly, "why do you let her talk to you like that?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. My 21-year-old daughter had just asked me why I accepted disrespect in my own home, and I didn't have a good answer. The truth was complicated and painful and involved years of trying to keep the peace, of believing that if I just tried harder, Patricia would eventually accept me, of watching David struggle with his mother's demands and trying to make it easier for him by absorbing her criticism myself. I don't know, honey. I finally said, and it was the most honest I'd been in years. I guess I thought it would get better. I thought she'd eventually see that I love your dad, that I'm a good mother to you and Michael, that I'm trying my best. But you can't make someone respect you if they've decided not to. Emma reached across and squeezed my hand. You're an amazing mom. And what Grandma said last night was completely out of line. Even Michael said so, and you know he never criticizes Grandma. I felt tears sting my eyes again. My kids had noticed. Of course they'd noticed. They'd grown up watching their grandmother tear me down and their father stay silent, and what kind of example had that set for them about relationships, about respect, about standing up for the people you love? The weekend was tense and uncomfortable. Patricia maintained an icy silence toward me, speaking only to David and the kids, acting as if I'd committed some unforgivable offense by walking away from the dinner table instead of sitting there and taking her abuse. David tried to mediate, suggesting we all just move past it, but something in me had fundamentally shifted. I couldn't move past it. I didn't want to move past it. I was tired of moving past things. On Sunday morning, Patricia packed her bags to return to Savannah, and she hugged David and the kids goodbye with great ceremony. She walked right past me without a word, loaded her Mercedes SUV with her Louis Vuitton luggage, and drove off without a backwards glance. David watched her go with an expression of profound relief mixed with anxiety, and I knew he was already dreading the phone calls that were coming, the guilt trips, the manipulation. Thank God that's over, Michael said under his breath as we stood in the driveway, and I saw David's shoulders tense. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Take a moment and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're building a community here of people who appreciate real stories about real challenges, and we'd love to have you as part of it. Just click that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Over the next few weeks, David became increasingly withdrawn. Patricia called him multiple times a day, and I could hear the conversations through the walls, her voice shrill even through the phone, his responses apologetic and placating. He started working later, coming home after I'd gone to bed, leaving early in the morning before I woke up. We were living in the same house, but existing in completely separate worlds. Christmas was approaching, and the elephant in the room was where we'd be spending it. For 23 years, we'd driven to Savannah without question. But I'd meant what I said at Thanksgiving. I wanted to start our own traditions. I wanted to spend Christmas morning in our own home, watching our kids open presents, making our own breakfast, being a family without Patricia's critical commentary. When I brought it up to David in mid-December, we were sitting in the living room, the Christmas tree we'd decorated half-heartedly glowing in the corner. He was scrolling through his phone, probably reading another guilt-inducing text from his mother, and he barely looked up when I spoke. David, we need to talk about Christmas.
His jaw tightened.
I already know what you're going to say, and the answer is we're going to Savannah like we always do. Mom's expecting us. She's already planned the whole menu and invited relatives. We can't just not show up. Yes, we can, I said calmly. We're adults. We have our own family. We can make our own choices about where we spend the holidays. David finally looked up from his phone, and his face was a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to make everything so complicated? We go to Savannah for Christmas. It's what we've always done. It's tradition. It's Patricia's tradition, I corrected. Not ours. We've never had our own Christmas, David. Not in 23 years of marriage. The kids are adults now. Don't you think it's time we created our own memories instead of always being extras in your mother's production? The fight that followed was ugly. Not screaming, we'd never been screamers, but the kind of cold, cutting argument where every grievance from the past 2 decades came pouring out. David accused me of trying to turn him against his mother. I accused him of choosing his mother over his wife. He said I was being selfish and ungrateful for everything Patricia had done for us, which apparently included her endless criticism and control. I said he was so deep in the fog of his mother's manipulation that You're supposed to be my husband first, I said, and I felt tears starting to sting my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You're supposed to choose us, choose our family, not let her dictate every holiday, every decision, every aspect of our lives. I can't remember the last time we did something without checking if it was okay, with Patricia first. The truth of those words hung in the air between us. Downstairs, I could hear Patricia's voice, sharp and insistent, probably telling the kids what an ungrateful daughter-in-law I was. I wondered if they were defending me, or if they'd learned to stay silent too, following their father's example. That Thanksgiving night was the beginning of the end of my marriage as I knew it, though I didn't realize it yet. I slept in the guest room. The one Patricia always complained had too firm a mattress, and I lay awake thinking about my life. I'd given up a promising career in advertising when Emma was born because Patricia had strong opinions about working mothers. I'd moved to this house in Buckhead because it was closer to David's office, and his mother approved of the neighborhood. I'd joined the country club Patricia belonged to, attended the charity events she organized, befriended the women she deemed acceptable. I'd molded myself into a shape that might finally earn her approval, and it had never been enough. It would never be enough. The next morning, Black Friday, I got up early before anyone else was awake. The house was quiet, peaceful without Patricia's commentary. I made myself coffee, sat at the kitchen island, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I Googled my own name plus my maiden name, Caroline Pierce. What came up surprised me. There were old articles about campaigns I'd worked on in my 20s, a few industry awards I'd won, references to creative work I'd done that I'd completely forgotten about. I'd been good at my job. I'd been passionate about it. And I'd given it all up because keeping Patricia happy had seemed more important than keeping myself whole. I heard footsteps on the stairs and braced myself, but it was Emma, not Patricia. My daughter padded into the kitchen in her pajamas, her dark hair messy from sleep, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from me at the island. "Mom," she said quietly, "why do you let her talk to you like that?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. My 21-year-old daughter had just asked me why I accepted disrespect in my own home, and I didn't have a good answer. The truth was complicated and painful and involved years of trying to keep the peace, of believing that if I just tried harder, Patricia would eventually accept me, of watching David struggle with his mother's demands and trying to make it easier for him by absorbing her criticism myself. "I don't know, honey," I finally said, and it was the most honest I'd been in years. "I guess I thought it would get better. I thought she'd eventually see that I love your dad, that I'm a good mother to you and Michael, that I'm trying my best. But you can't make someone respect you if they've decided not to." Emma reached across and squeezed my hand. "You're an amazing mom. And what Grandma said last night was completely out of line. Even Michael said so, and you know he never criticizes Grandma." I felt tears sting my eyes again. My kids had noticed. Of course they'd noticed. They'd grown up watching their grandmother tear me down and their father stay silent, and what kind of example had that set for them about relationships, about respect, about standing up for the people you love? The weekend was tense and uncomfortable. Patricia maintained an icy silence toward me, speaking only to David and the kids, acting as if I'd committed some unforgivable offense by walking away from the dinner table instead of sitting there and taking her abuse. David tried to mediate, suggesting we all just move past it, but something in me had fundamentally shifted. I couldn't move past it. I didn't want to move past it. I was tired of moving past things. On Sunday morning, Patricia packed her bags to return to Savannah, and she hugged David and the kids goodbye with great ceremony. She walked right past me without a word, loaded her Mercedes SUV with her Louis Vuitton luggage, and drove off without a backwards glance. David watched her go with an expression of profound relief mixed with anxiety, and I knew he was already dreading the phone calls that were coming, the guilt trips, the manipulation. "Thank God that's over," Michael said under his breath as we stood in the driveway, and I saw David's shoulders tense. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Take a moment and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're building a community here of people who appreciate real stories about real challenges, and we'd love to have you as part of it. Just click that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Over the next few weeks, David became increasingly withdrawn. Patricia called him multiple times a day, and I could hear the conversations through the walls, her voice shrill even through the phone, his responses apologetic and placating. He started working later, coming home after I'd gone to bed, leaving early in the morning before I woke up. We were living in the same house, but existing in completely separate worlds. Christmas was approaching, and the elephant in the room was where we'd be spending it. For 23 years, we'd driven to Savannah without question. But I'd meant what I said at Thanksgiving. I wanted to start our own traditions. I wanted to spend Christmas morning in our own home, watching our kids open presents, making our own breakfast, being a family without Patricia's critical commentary. When I brought it up to David in mid-December, we were sitting in the living room, the Christmas tree we'd decorated half-heartedly glowing in the corner. He was scrolling through his phone, probably reading another guilt-inducing text from his mother, and he barely looked up when I spoke. "David, we need to talk about Christmas."
His jaw tightened.
"I already know what you're going to say, and the answer is we're going to Savannah like we always do. Mom's expecting us. She's already planned the whole menu and invited relatives. We can't just not show up." "Yes, we can," I said calmly. "We're adults. We have our own family. We can make our own choices about where we spend the holidays." David finally looked up from his phone, and his face was a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. "Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to make everything so complicated? We go to Savannah for Christmas. It's what we've always done. It's tradition." "It's Patricia's tradition," I corrected. "Not ours. We've never had our own Christmas, David. Not in 23 years of marriage. The kids are adults now. Don't you think it's time we created our own memories instead of always being extras in your mother's production?" The fight that followed was ugly. Not screaming, we'd never been screamers, but the kind of cold, cutting argument where every grievance from the past 2 decades came pouring out. David accused me of trying to turn him against his mother. I accused him of choosing his mother over his wife. He said I was being selfish and ungrateful for everything Patricia had done for us, which apparently included her endless criticism and control. I said he was so deep in the fog of his mother's manipulation that David looked different. Thinner, older somehow, like the separation had aged him. He ordered a salad and picked at it nervously while I ate my sandwich, waiting for him to say whatever he'd asked me here to say. "I've been thinking a lot," he finally began. "About us, about what went wrong, about what happens next." And I prompted, not willing to make this easy for him. "I think we should make the separation permanent. File for divorce. It's clear we want different things, and there's no point dragging it out." I set down my sandwich and studied his face. "Is this what you want, David? Or is this what Patricia wants?" He flinched at his mother's name. "It doesn't matter anymore, does it? Whether it's what she wants or what I want. We're not happy together. We haven't been happy for a long time." He wasn't wrong. "Okay," I said. "If that's what you want, I'm not going to fight you on it." Relief washed over his face, and I felt a stab of something, sadness maybe, for the years we'd lost trying to make something work that was fundamentally broken. "I'll be fair about the division of assets," he said. "The house is in both our names, and we've got savings and retirement accounts. I'm not trying to screw you over, Caroline." "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant it. Whatever our problems, David wasn't a vindictive person. He was weak, maybe, too controlled by his mother, unable to set boundaries, but not cruel. We worked out the basics over that lunch. He wanted to keep his father's real estate business, which was fine with me. I wanted to keep the house, which surprised him, but he agreed. We'd split the retirement accounts and savings 50-50. The kids were adults, so there was no custody to fight over, and neither Emma nor Michael would need financial support much longer, since they were both nearly done with school. "What about Patricia?" I asked because I couldn't help myself. "Is she happy about this?" David had the grace to look ashamed. "She thinks it's for the best. She's never understood why I married you in the first place, honestly. She had someone else picked out for me, a girl from Savannah, but I chose you instead." He said it like it was a confession, like he was admitting to some youthful rebellion that had ultimately been a mistake. "You chose me," I repeated slowly, "but You never chose me over her. That was always the problem, wasn't it? You wanted both, your mother's approval and your marriage to me, and when you couldn't have both, you chose her. He didn't deny it. We finished lunch in uncomfortable silence, split the check like the civilized adults we were pretending to be, and went our separate ways. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward. We hired a mediator instead of lawyers, worked through the assets calmly, and by August, 6 months after David moved out, the divorce was final. 23 years of marriage dissolved in a stack of legal documents and a judge's signature. Emma and Michael took it reasonably well, or at least as well as adult children can take their parents' divorce. Emma threw herself into her senior year at Georgia State, planning to graduate the following spring. Michael focused on his engineering studies at Georgia Tech, and I suspected he was relieved not to have to navigate the tension between his parents anymore. I threw myself into work. The creative consultant position had turned into a full-time senior role, and I was thriving. I led campaigns for products targeting women my age, bringing an authenticity to the work that the younger creatives couldn't quite capture. I traveled for client meetings, stayed late brainstorming in conference rooms, felt my brain firing in ways it hadn't in decades. In September, I ran into an old friend from college, Jennifer, at a Braves game Emma had dragged me to. Jennifer had moved to Denver years ago, but was back in Atlanta visiting family. We exchanged numbers, promising to keep in touch, and she mentioned something that planted a seed in my mind. "You should come visit," she'd said. "Denver is amazing. The mountains, the weather, the culture. Plus, there's a huge advertising scene there. You'd love it." I'd laughed it off at the time, but the idea lingered. What was keeping me in Atlanta now? The house? The kids would graduate and move on with their lives.
The job?
I could find work anywhere, especially now that I'd rebuilt my reputation. I'd spent my entire adult life in Atlanta, in Patricia's shadow, in the life David and I had built that had turned out to be more prison than partnership. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss what happens next in the story. We're almost at our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and your support is what makes this possible. Just click that subscribe button right now. By October, a year after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, I'd made a decision. I was going to sell the house and move. Maybe Denver, maybe somewhere else, but somewhere new, somewhere that didn't have memories of Patricia's criticism on every corner, somewhere I could be entirely myself without the weight of who I'd tried to be for 2 decades. I told Emma and Michael first, and they surprised me by being supportive. "You should do it, Mom," Michael said. "You've spent long enough living for everyone else. It's time to live for yourself." When David found out, he seemed almost offended, like my leaving Atlanta was somehow a judgment on him. "You're really going to just pick up and move?" he asked when he came by to get the last of his things from the garage. "What about the kids?" "The kids are adults with their own lives," I said calmly. "And I'll only be a plane ride away wherever I go." "You managed to choose your mother over your marriage for 23 years, David. I'm choosing myself for once." I put the house on the market in November, and it sold within 2 weeks. The market in Buckhead was hot, and the house was beautiful despite Patricia's constant criticism of it. I started applying for jobs in different cities: Denver, Seattle, Portland, San Diego, places as far from Savannah and Patricia's influence as I could get. Emma graduated from Georgia State in December, a semester early, and accepted a job offer with a tech company in Austin, Texas. Michael had another year and a half left at Georgia Tech, but he was old enough to handle his father being in Atlanta, without me there as a buffer. They were launching their own lives, and it was time for me to launch mine. In January, exactly 1 year after David moved out, I accepted a position as creative director at a boutique agency in Portland, Oregon. The job was perfect, challenging, well-paid, at a company that valued creativity and fresh perspectives. Portland was about as far from Atlanta and Savannah as I could get, both geographically and culturally, and that was exactly what I wanted. I sold most of my furniture, packed what I wanted to keep, said goodbye to the few friends I'd maintained through the years of being Mrs. David Hayes, and I booked a one-way flight to Portland. Emma came home from Austin to help me pack, and Michael drove over from his apartment near campus. We spent my last weekend in Atlanta going to our favorite restaurants, walking through Piedmont Park one last time, reminiscing about the good memories while acknowledging the hard ones. "Are you scared, Mom?" Emma asked on my last night as we sat on the floor of my empty living room eating pizza because all the furniture was gone. "Terrified," I admitted. "I'm 46 years old, starting over in a new city where I don't know anyone, in a job I've only had video interviews for, leaving everything familiar behind. But I'm also excited. For the first time in decades, I get to decide who I want to be without anyone else's input or approval." Michael raised his Coke can in a toast. "To Mom, the bravest person I know." We clinked our drinks together, and I felt a rush of love for these two people I'd raised, who turned out to be so much more emotionally intelligent and brave than their father or I had been at their age. The next morning, they drove me to the airport. We hugged goodbye at the curb, and I promised to call when I landed, to text frequently, to visit for holidays. Emma was crying and trying to hide it. Michael was putting on a brave face, but his eyes were red. I was leaving them, in a way, but I was also showing them that it's never too late to choose yourself, to start over, to refuse to accept a life that doesn't fit anymore. I didn't tell David I was leaving until I was already in Portland, settled into my temporary housing, starting my new job. I sent him a brief email letting him know I'd moved, providing my new address for any legal documents or mail, and that was it. He didn't respond, and I didn't expect him to. Patricia, I heard through Emma, was thrilled that I'd left town. Apparently, she saw it as final proof that I'd never really belonged in their family, that I was giving up and running away. She could think whatever she wanted. After 23 years of trying to earn her approval and failing, I finally understood that her opinion of me said everything about her and nothing about me. Subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories like this one about finding yourself after losing yourself in someone else's expectations. We're building a community here, and we'd love to have you as part of it. Hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Portland was everything I needed it to be, rainy and green and progressive, and far from everything I'd known. The agency welcomed me with open arms, and I threw myself into the work with the energy of someone who'd been creatively starved for decades. I rented a small apartment in the Alberta Arts District, all exposed brick and huge windows, nothing like the traditional house in Buckhead that Patricia had deemed acceptable. I bought furniture I liked, hung art I chose, lived in a space that reflected my taste for the first time in my adult life. I made friends, mostly colleagues at first, but gradually expanding to include people I met at coffee shops, art galleries, the gym. I dated occasionally, nothing serious. Just remembering what it felt like to have someone ask about my day and actually listen to the answer, to share a meal without criticism, to be seen as Caroline rather than as David's unsuitable wife or Patricia's disappointing daughter-in-law. In March, 2 years after that Thanksgiving dinner, Emma called me with news. She was getting engaged to Marcus, her boyfriend from college who'd moved to Austin to be near her. They were planning a small wedding for the summer, and she wanted my help planning it. "Is Dad invited?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it. "Of course, Mom. He's still my dad. But Grandma Patricia isn't invited. Marcus and I talked about it, and we don't want that negative energy at our wedding. She's never been anything but critical of our relationship because Marcus's family is middle class and from California, and we're done trying to meet her impossible standards." I felt a surge of pride for my daughter, setting boundaries I'd never been able to set, choosing her partner over her grandmother's approval. "I think that's incredibly mature and brave," I said. "I learned from watching you," Emma replied. "It took you 23 years, but you finally chose yourself. That's what I'm doing too. I'm choosing Marcus, and I'm choosing the kind of family we want to build together, one where people are kind and supportive, not critical and controlling." The wedding was beautiful, held in a botanical garden in Austin in July. David came alone, and we were polite and civil, talking mostly about how proud we were of Emma and what a good man Marcus was. Michael was the best man, giving a speech that had everyone crying and laughing. I watched my daughter marry someone who clearly adored her, who treated her as an equal partner, who'd already demonstrated he'd stand up for her when necessary, and I felt both happiness for her and a strange grief for my younger self who'd married someone who'd never quite managed to do the same. David and I found ourselves alone for a moment during the reception, standing at the edge of the dance floor watching Emma and Marcus sway to their first dance.
She looks happy, David said.
She's happy, I agreed. She chose well. There was a long pause, and then David said quietly, I'm sorry, Caroline. For everything. For not standing up to my mother, for choosing the easy path instead of the right one, for wasting 23 years of your life. I turned to look at him, this man who'd once been my husband, the father of my children, who'd become a stranger through 1,000 small choices to prioritize his mother's approval over our marriage. They weren't entirely wasted, I said. We got Emma and Michael out of it. They're the best parts of both of us. Mom's sick, he said abruptly, not looking at me.
Cancer.
They caught it late. She's been undergoing treatment, but the prognosis isn't good. She has maybe 6 months. I should have felt something, maybe satisfaction or vindication or even sympathy, but I felt mostly nothing. Patricia was a 70-year-old woman who'd spent her entire adult life controlling the people around her, and now she was facing something she couldn't control, manipulate, or money her way out of. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it in the abstract way you're sorry when anyone is suffering, but I didn't feel personally affected by it. She asked about you, David continued. Asked if you were here. When I told her no, that you'd moved to Portland, she seemed almost, I don't know, regretful maybe? She said something about how she never thought you'd actually leave, that she thought you'd always be there trying to please her. That's the problem with treating people badly, I said. Eventually they stopped putting up with it. Before the end of this story, I want to remind you one more time to subscribe to our channel. We share real stories about real people facing real challenges, and your subscription helps us continue. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every single one matters. Click that red button now, and be part of this community. David nodded slowly, absorbing my words. She wanted me to ask if you'd come visit her. In Savannah. Before it's too late. I stared at him, genuinely shocked. Patricia Montgomery Hayes, the woman who'd spent 23 years making it clear I wasn't good enough for her son, her family, or her social circle, wanted to see me now that she was dying. The audacity of it was almost breathtaking. No, I said simply. Emma and Marcus got married the following summer in a small ceremony in Portland, by the Columbia River Gorge with the mountains in the background. It was intimate and personal and full of joy, nothing like the formal Savannah weddings Patricia had always insisted on. David came, and he was cordial but distant. He'd started dating someone Patricia had introduced him to before she died, a widow from an old Savannah family, exactly the type of woman his mother had always wanted for him. I wished him well, and I meant it. He was living the life Patricia had designed for him, and if that made him happy, who was I to judge? Michael graduated from Georgia Tech and accepted a job with a tech company in Seattle, close enough to Portland that we could visit regularly. He brought home a girlfriend eventually, a brilliant software engineer named Priya, whose parents had immigrated from India. I loved her immediately, and I thought with some irony about how Patricia would have reacted to Michael dating someone outside her narrow definition of acceptable. But Patricia was gone, and Michael was free to make his own choices without that weight. In the fall, 3 years after I'd moved to Portland, I met someone. His name was James. He was 52, a divorced architect with 2 grown sons, and he had kind eyes and a dry sense of humor that made me laugh. We met at a gallery opening, started talking about the art, ended up getting coffee that turned into dinner. We took it slow, both of us carrying baggage from previous marriages, both of us careful not to repeat old patterns. James had been married to a woman who'd cheated on him repeatedly, who'd made him feel like he wasn't exciting enough, ambitious enough, successful enough. He understood what it felt like to twist yourself into shapes trying to please someone who was fundamentally unpleasable. We compared notes on our respective disasters of first marriages, laughed at the absurdity of some of it, acknowledged the pain of the rest. My ex used to say I was boring. James told me over dinner one night, 6 months into our relationship, that I was too practical, too focused on work, not spontaneous enough. I spent years trying to be more exciting, planning surprise trips, trying new hobbies, anything to make her look at me the way she looked at the guys she was cheating with. Took me way too long to realize the problem wasn't me. My mother-in-law used to say, I wasn't half the woman she was, I shared. And I spent 23 years trying to prove her wrong by becoming exactly who she wanted me to be. Took me way too long to realize that the problem wasn't me either. We understood each other in a way that only people who'd survived similar experiences could. There was no pressure to be anything other than who we actually were. He didn't need me to be more sophisticated or better bred or from the right family. I didn't need him to be more exciting or less boring or anything other than himself. It was refreshingly, beautifully simple. By the time I turned 50, I'd been in Portland for 4 years, and I felt more myself than I ever had. I had a career I loved, kids who were thriving, a man who treated me with respect and genuine affection, friends who knew the real me, and a life I'd built on my own terms. The decades I'd spent trying to earn Patricia's approval felt like another lifetime, a cautionary tale about what happens when you let other people define your worth. Emma had her first baby in the spring, a little girl they named Grace. I flew to Austin to meet my granddaughter, and I held this tiny person who represented a new generation, one hopefully free from the patterns that had trapped Patricia and nearly trapped me. Emma was a confident mother, making choices based on what felt right for her family rather than what anyone else expected. Marcus was a devoted father, fully present in a way David had never quite managed to be. They were breaking cycles, creating something new and healthier. Michael got engaged to Priya, and they planned a wedding that would honor both of their backgrounds, a traditional Indian ceremony followed by a Western reception. It would have given Patricia an aneurysm, I thought with dark amusement, this blending of cultures and traditions. But it was beautiful and meaningful and entirely them, which was exactly what a wedding should be. David sent me an occasional email, usually about the kids or some legal matter that needed attention. His relationship with the Savannah widow had apparently not worked out, and he was single again, still living in Atlanta, still running his father's real estate business, still very much in the world Patricia had created for him, even though she was gone. I felt sorry for him sometimes, this man who'd never quite figured out how to live for himself, but it wasn't my problem to solve anymore. I want to pause here and remind you to subscribe if you haven't already. These stories matter, and your support helps us continue sharing them. We're working toward our goal, and every subscription counts. Hit that button and be part of this growing community. On what would have been my 28th wedding anniversary, James and I were having dinner at a small restaurant in Portland's Pearl District. He didn't know the significance of the date, and I hadn't mentioned it, but I was thinking about it nonetheless. 28 years ago, I'd married David in a formal ceremony in Savannah that Patricia had planned down to the last detail, wearing a dress Patricia had approved, inviting guests Patricia had selected. I'd been so young, so hopeful, so certain that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. "You're quiet tonight," James observed, reaching across the table to take my hand. "Everything okay?" "Just thinking," I said. "About roads not taken, choices made, time spent trying to be someone I wasn't." He squeezed my hand gently. "Any regrets?" I thought about it honestly. Did I regret marrying David, spending 23 years in a marriage that ultimately failed? Did I regret the years I'd given up my career, molded myself to Patricia's expectations, lost pieces of myself along the way? Did I regret not leaving sooner, standing up for myself earlier, refusing to accept treatment I never deserved? "No," I said finally. "Not regrets, exactly. I wish I'd been braver sooner. I wish I'd understood earlier that I didn't need anyone's approval to have value. But I got Emma and Michael from that marriage, and I learned things about myself that I needed to learn, even if I learned them the hard way. Everything that happened led me here, to this moment, to this life I've built. I can't regret the path when I like where I ended up." James smiled, that warm, genuine smile that still made my heart skip a little. "I like where you ended up too." We were engaged 6 months later, a quiet proposal on a hiking trail in the Columbia River Gorge, just the two of us and the mountains and the river. Nothing elaborate, no family drama, no one's approval needed except our own. We planned a small wedding for the following summer, just our kids and a few close friends, casual and warm and entirely us. Emma and Michael were thrilled. They loved James, loved seeing me happy, loved that I'd found someone who treated me the way they'd always wished their father had treated me. David sent a brief congratulatory email that was polite but cool, and I wondered if it bothered him that I'd moved on so completely while he seemed stuck in the same patterns that had defined his entire adult life. The wedding was perfect in its simplicity. We got married in James's backyard in Portland, surrounded by the garden he'd spent years cultivating, under an arbor his sons had built. Emma stood as my maid of honor, with baby Grace on her hip. Michael walked me down the aisle, which felt appropriate since he'd been one of the people who'd supported me through the hardest transition of my life. Priya was there, and Marcus, and James's sons with their families, and the small group of friends we'd both accumulated in our Portland lives. There was no Patricia to critique the flowers or the catering or my dress. No David staying silent while his mother made cutting remarks. No pretending to be someone I wasn't. Just two people who'd survived difficult first marriages, who'd learned hard lessons about themselves and what they needed, promising to build something different and better together. In my vows, I said something I'd been thinking about for years. James, you've taught me that love doesn't require transformation. You've never asked me to be anyone other than who I am, and that's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. I promise to give you that same gift, to love you exactly as you are, to build a partnership based on mutual respect rather than impossible expectations. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden, including mine. We honeymooned in New Zealand, 2 weeks of adventure and beauty and absolutely no family drama. We hiked through mountains, explored cities, ate food we couldn't pronounce, laughed constantly, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of being together without the weight of past baggage crushing us. It was the kind of honeymoon I'd dreamed of 28 years earlier, but never quite gotten, because even that had been shaped by what Patricia thought was appropriate for a Hayes family wedding trip. When we returned to Portland, we combined our households, selling James's house and my apartment, and buying a mid-century modern home with wall-to-wall windows overlooking the city. We decorated it together, compromising and collaborating, creating a space that reflected both of our tastes. It was nothing like the traditional house in Buckhead that had never quite felt like mine, nothing like any space Patricia would have approved of, and it was absolutely perfect. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I continued thriving at work. James's architecture practice was busy. We hosted dinners for our combined families. We traveled when we could. We built the kind of life that neither of us had known was possible in our first marriages. We had disagreements, of course, moments of friction, but we'd both learned how to communicate, how to compromise, how to be partners rather than adversaries or strangers sharing a house. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss more stories like this one. Real people, real challenges, real growth. Click that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your support means everything. 5 years after I'd pushed that chair back at Thanksgiving dinner and walked away from Patricia's latest insult, I was sitting on my deck in Portland watching the sun set over the city, James beside me with his hand in mine, and I thought about that moment that had changed everything. That single decision to stop accepting unacceptable treatment, to value my own dignity over keeping the peace, to choose myself even when it meant blowing up a life I'd spent decades building. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, noticing my reflective mood. "About how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away," I said. "Even when it's from something you've invested years in, even when people tell you you're giving up or being selfish or not trying hard enough. Sometimes walking away is the only way to save yourself." Emma called the next day with news. She was pregnant again, another girl. They were going to name her Caroline after me. I cried when she told me, overwhelmed with the honor of having my granddaughter carry my name, of knowing that Emma saw me as someone worth honoring rather than someone who'd failed at marriage. "You're my hero, Mom," Emma said on that call. "You taught me that it's never too late to choose yourself, that you don't have to accept cruelty just because it comes from family, that walking away from something toxic is strength, not weakness. I want my daughter to know she came from a woman who was brave enough to start over at 46, who rebuilt her life from scratch, who refused to let anyone make her feel small. Michael and Priya got married the following spring in a beautiful fusion ceremony that would have scandalized Patricia, but was absolutely magical. Watching my son marry the woman he loved, seeing him so confident and happy, knowing he'd never feel pressured to choose his mother's approval over his wife's well-being, I felt like maybe, finally, the cycles were truly broken. David came to the wedding alone, looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered. We spoke briefly, politely, and he mentioned that he'd been in therapy for the past year, working through his relationship with his mother and why he'd never been able to set boundaries with her. "I'm realizing now all the ways I failed you," he said quietly, the reception buzzing with music and laughter around us. "All the times I should have stood up for you and didn't. All the years I let my fear of my mother's disapproval destroy my marriage. I'm sorry, Caroline. I know it's too late, but I'm sorry." "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant it. Not because it changed anything or undid any damage, but because growth is always worth acknowledging, even when it comes too late to save what was broken. "I hope you find what you're looking for, David. I hope you figure out how to live for yourself instead of for Patricia's ghost." He nodded, and there was real sadness in his eyes. "You figured it out. You're happy. I'm glad one of us made it to the other side." "It's not too late for you either," I said gently. "You're only 52. You have time to build something real if you're willing to do the work." I don't know if he ever did. We fell out of touch after that, connected only through our mutual love for Emma and Michael and the grandchildren that would come. He remained in Atlanta, I remained in Portland, and we existed in entirely separate worlds connected only by the past we'd shared. As I approach my 55th birthday, nearly a decade after that Thanksgiving dinner that changed my life, I think about Patricia's letter and her final admission that I'd been stronger than she'd given me credit for. I think about the years I wasted trying to earn the approval of someone who was determined not to give it. I think about David and his inability to choose partnership over parental approval. But mostly, I think about the life I've built since walking away, the version of myself I've become when I stopped trying to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. I have 3 grandchildren now, with a 4th on the way. I'm still executive creative director at the agency, mentoring younger women and encouraging them to never shrink themselves to fit into spaces that were never designed for them. James and I have been married for 6 years, and it gets better every year because we build on a foundation of mutual respect rather than trying to force something that doesn't fit. Emma and Michael are thriving, building their own families with the lessons they learned from watching both my failures and my eventual success. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd walked away sooner. If I'd had the courage at 30 to do what I finally did at 46. Would I have built an even bigger career? Would I have found James earlier? Would I have spent more years living authentically instead of performing for an audience that would never applaud? But then I remember that we become who we are through all of our experiences, including the painful ones. I learned patience and resilience in that marriage, even if I also learned too much tolerance for intolerable behavior. I learned what I didn't want, which helped me recognize what I did want when I finally found it. I learned that it's never too late to start over, that you're never too old to choose yourself, that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit that something isn't working and walk away. Subscribe now if this story resonated with you. We share real experiences about real people facing real challenges, and your support helps us grow. Click that subscribe button and be part of our community, working toward 1,000 subscribers. If I could go back and talk to my younger self, sitting at that Thanksgiving table with Patricia's latest insult hanging in the air, I'd tell her to push that chair back even harder. I'd tell her not to waste 23 years trying to earn approval from someone who's determined to withhold it. I'd tell her that her worth isn't determined by whether Patricia or anyone else recognizes it. I'd tell her that the life waiting for her on the other side of that decision to walk away is better than anything she can imagine while sitting in that dining room trying to be small enough to avoid criticism. But I can't go back, and maybe that's okay. Maybe some lessons have to be learned the hard way. Maybe some of us need to spend years being beaten down before we find the strength to stand back up. Maybe the story of becoming yourself is always a story of losing yourself first and then fighting your way back. Patricia was wrong about a lot of things, but she was right about one thing in the end. I wasn't half the woman she was. I was twice the woman because I had the courage to change, to grow, to admit when something wasn't working and do the terrifying work of starting over. Patricia lived her entire life within the rigid confines of rules she'd been taught, never questioning whether those rules served her or imprisoned her. She died still believing that bloodlines and social standing mattered more than kindness and character. I lived, and I learned, and I changed, and I grew. And that made all the difference. Looking back now, that Thanksgiving dinner wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of me finally choosing myself. The beginning of understanding that I didn't need anyone's permission to have worth. The beginning of a life built on authenticity rather than approval-seeking. The beginning of becoming the woman my granddaughters would one day look up to, not because I never made mistakes, but because I eventually found the courage to correct them. So, here's to pushing back your chair. Here's to walking away from tables where you're not valued. Here's to starting over at any age. Here's to choosing yourself when everyone else is asking you to choose them. Here's to building lives that reflect who we are rather than who others think we should be. And here's to the moment when you finally realize that you've always been enough. You just needed to believe it yourself. Final quote for thumbnail asterisk. I spent 23 years trying to be enough for her. Then I spent 5 minutes deciding I was done. Turns out I was always twice the woman she claimed I'd never be.